Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're joined by Dr. Eileen Boris, who's a clinical and political psychologist who's pioneered the concept of political forgiveness on the individual, community and national level. She's addressed the United Nations and has worked for over 30 years to build peace in areas of conflict around the world, including Rwanda, South Africa, Liberia, Nigeria, Ethiopia and the Middle East. So interesting times for your work, Eileen. And Eileen is also the creator of Healing the Divide, a programme that trains leaders and other individuals interested in applying the principles of political forgiveness to transform their lives and create social change. I'm really glad to have you on today, Eileen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to our conversation together.
Thank you, Eileen. That's quite some CV, isn't it? Thanks so much for coming along. So could we begin perhaps by you telling us what is political forgiveness and how did you become interested in this subject?
Well, political forgiveness is basically a process that involves joining truth, forbearance, empathy, and a commitment to repair fractured relationships. And forgiveness becomes political when it gets involved with the public domain. So as we begin to think about how to heal communities, and we think about these principles, and we think about learning how to let go of the past and not excusing it, but moving forward in a way that neither ignores the past evil or excuses it, or overlooks justice or reduces justice to revenge. It begins to look at a situation with a different set of eyes, where we value a justice that restores communities instead of a justice that destroys it. So it's a really coming together with groups of people in a healing capacity, understanding that there's a process that leads up to repair, which includes things such as social justice that I mentioned. And why I became interested, or how I became interested, I think stems back to when I was a young girl, actually. I grew up in a family where my father had to leave Germany right before the Holocaust. He luckily got out in the early 30s. And so I wasn't traumatized by the Holocaust, but I had relatives who came out later who shared stories of the Holocaust. And I remember thinking, this could never happen again to anyone. Thinking about that as a young girl. Now, little did I know, years later, I would become first a counseling psychologist and then a political psychologist. But as I look back, that was a very strong motivator as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because to this day, I feel so strongly that genocide should not even be part of our vocabulary anymore. It should never, never exist. And so that's how I got into this.
Thanks very much. That's a very powerful account of your beginning story, Eileen. It's just to help me get a grasp on things. Would the peace and reconciliation that took place in South Africa be an example of the kind of thing you're talking about?
It's certainly a model. And when I think about how do we begin to develop, because I'm really trying to develop theory around political forgiveness, what does that look like? And of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that people go to first is South Africa. And that's because, first of all, of how Desmond Tutu formed it and the prominence that forgiveness played. And so I began to really look at that, and I really began to study the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, there's so many touching stories of forgiveness that took place at the hearings during the time of the commission that were very moving and touching. And also the thinking behind the movement of restorative justice, which was the premise for their amnesty. That if you come and you tell us the truth of what's happening, you will be granted amnesty. That's a very broad version of what happened. The other interesting thing about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that people on the international scene probably thought more of it than people in South Africa. And there were many, many important lessons to learn. For example, how did the forgiveness really help in the healing? Were the victims of the crimes people who really forgave in a very deep healing capacity, or did they feel pressured to do it, or was it because they thought that they, quote, should do it? And so those were important learning lessons about forgiveness, especially in a group context. So it served as a very useful model, and it also served as a real teaching tool as to what we can do better moving forward.
Have you come across Bas Dreisinger, Eileen?
Sorry?
Have you come across Bas Dreisinger? She's a professor of creative writing in New York, I believe, one of her books is called Incarceration Nations, and she visited 10 prison systems from across the world, and she went to Rwanda as well as South Africa, and again, kind of like reporting on the role that forgiveness playing in some of the alternative models of justice as opposed to the more sort of more vengeful sort that we might see certainly in Britain and probably in America. But really interesting work being done in Rwanda, where you've got this big rift in society and having to help heal society, really, because people have got to learn to live comfortably alongside each other.
Well, and I think Rwanda is also very interesting, because here again, what happened after the genocide was that everybody became Rwandans. They weren't Hutus or Tutsis anymore. And in theory, that might sound great, but what goes on in our psyches and what's been passed down, you can't turn off the switch that fast, so to speak. And so how do you really deal with it? And I think this speaks to the importance of forgiveness, and, that forgiveness doesn't happen overnight. It's a long-term process. Some people may not ever get to the end of the process, but we have to give people the space to first heal their wounds. And when you think about a trajectory in terms of political forgiveness, the piece of repair is important. Things have to come before that, such as justice and social justice. And here was actually a criticism of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that what happened to justice? Individuals felt like my justice as an individual was short-tailed for the group social justice. And there's a lot to be learned there. And then, we need to be able to tell our stories. We need to be able to share our anger and our grief in a safe container. And only until we can do that can we begin to learn how to walk in somebody else's shoes. And only when we can be able to do that can we begin to understand the psychological landscape from where they came. And this is where the history of Rwanda becomes really important. Why did the Hutus do what they did? It didn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't make it right. But when you understand the history, you can understand how they felt that the Tutsis were so privileged and had a higher place in society, and that began to breed a lot of resentment and anger. And until you really address the underlying emotions, that emotional undertow, can you get to a healing place, which then opens the doors for forgiveness. And only then can people begin to feel connected in unity and become Rwandans again. So there was a whole process that really needs to happen. And that's really what political forgiveness is about.
That's fascinating. And I think it's really interesting, this link between justice and forgiveness, because, of course, there's a very recent situation in our country, in the UK, which you may have heard about. Our former Archbishop said that he would forgive somebody called John Smythe, who was quite a senior person in the Church of England, who abused many, many, many children. And this caused quite an outrage, really, the idea that you could forgive without having seen any justice.
It's hollow, and it doesn't last, because forgiveness, first of all, is about letting go of our own emotional burdens, and you can't do that if you don't talk about it. How can you let go of something if you can't even talk about it? And that's really the first part of a healing process. It's also the first part of healing trauma. And when you also look at it, the process of forgiveness really coincides, runs parallel to the process of healing trauma. And for all of us that do trauma work, we know we've got to get the secret out. We've got to get the story out. And that's the first step in the healing process.
I think it'd be an interesting interview for you to watch, Eileen, because it's really a bit of a masterclass in how not to give an apology, because I think also he'd, rather than making it clear he's forgiving for his own, how he was harmed by the person, it sounds like he's forgiving the man for, on behalf of obviously lots of people who would not want to extend that forgiveness. I think as societies, we're probably not very good at thinking about accountability and forgiveness and justice and how all those things link into one another, and being clear about what each is.
And there again, that's part of the kind of the structure. There's got to first be accountability, and then there's got to be social justice, and then there can be repair. And these are the things that we're learning. I would love to hear that interview, by the way.
I'll send you the link.
That would be really, really great. And this gets into, I know, a question that a lot of people ask me, which is, what are some of the myths about forgiveness? What are, we have so many misperceptions, ideas about it. First of all, forgiveness is not about letting somebody off the hook. It's about having that person take accountability. And it's not about forgetting painful experiences. So many people say, well, you forgive and you forget. How can you forget if you've been raped? How can you forget if you've survived a genocide? It's not about forgetting. But what happens when you are working on forgiveness, it's about letting go of your own emotional burden. So in order to let go of the anger, you've got to walk through the anger. You've got to talk about it. Maybe the guilt feelings that in some cases, depending on what has happened, you've got to talk about it. And as you begin to understand what those emotions were saying to you, then you can only, at that point, begin to walk in somebody else's shoes, as I mentioned earlier. And only then can you begin to release your own emotional burden. And so what forgiveness is really about is being able to lessen that emotional burden. So eventually, hopefully, you can have peace of mind about what happened because you're seeing it differently. You don't forget it, but you don't have that real awful pain around it that causes so much angst and worry. That's what lessens. That's what forgiveness is all about. It's not excusing poor behavior. You could be in an ugly divorce. It could be an abusive situation. You'd be crazy to go back to the person just because you forgive them. You can forgive them, which really means you can finally have peace of mind with them about what's gone on, and you can move forward in your life. But it doesn't mean that you have to be in a relationship with them. It doesn't even mean that you have to reconcile with them. It just means that you're able to recognize that the past is over and that you can move forward from it. Another thing is people think you have to be religious or have some kind of religious experience to forgive. And I think one of the main points that I really want to get across is forgiveness is a skill. It's a skill that anyone can learn, and we can all practice forgiveness. It's for everybody, and it's not about minimizing your hurt. Your feelings are real. So these are just kind of the misperceptions that people carry with them.
You touched on the idea of forgiveness being a skill, and I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, because I haven't quite understood it, and I'm not sure whether what you're meaning is something we often in cognitive therapy will talk about people learning skills, but I'm wondering if you're not talking about a rather deeper kind of psychological process.
You know, I think forgiveness can be a very deep psychological process, but here again, it's a continuum. So when I'm working with people, I start off in a very pragmatic way. And so the first thing I talk about is, okay, how can we let go of our grievances? And, there's a whole process. Why do we have grievances? Well, for one thing, we've taken on things too personally. Even what might seem the most horrific things, we have to realize divorces happen to many people, and it's not just about us. So we have to just recognize we take things on way too personally, and then we blame the person who we feel has offended us. And yes, they've done horrible things, but these people are not dictating how we should handle it. And so we have to recognize that we have agency and that we are responsible for our own emotional well-being. And for some people, that in itself is an eye-opener, because we tend to want to blame, blame, blame. And anybody who's been in a marriage long enough or has been a marriage counselor, we know that blaming happens all the time, and it is something that can really erode relationships. And then, if we take things too personally, we begin to blame, we're also creating our own grievance story. And so I have people really take a look at, okay, what is that grievance story? And then how do we change it? So that becomes one of the, basic skills that people can learn. How to change our grievance stories, how to change the channel. Instead of always feeling angry every morning, change the channel to gratitude and begin to start feeling gratitude for things, or love, and hug your pet and really begin to get in touch with the love that's also inside of us. So these are some of the skills that are very basic. Now, there are people who have a bit more of a spiritual perspective, and so we can go deeper and deeper. And for people who forgive, even on what it might appear to be a mundane level, all of a sudden recognize, I understand the meaning of grace. All of a sudden, I've been able to let go of this anger. I've really wanted to. And one of the things I tell people, if you're really sincere in wanting to let go of your anger and your grief, and you keep working on it, that sincerity is part of the healing process. And that sincerity, I had a client the other day who really wanted to forgive her husband. They were living in separate dwellings at this point, and she really loved him, but things really went south in the marriage, and she really wanted to forgive him. She wanted to really let go of her anger, and we worked for weeks on that, and she had reason to be angry for sure. But then she began to understand where this other person was coming from, and she understood, yes, it's not right, and we don't have to like it. And one day she was just saying, I just really want to let go of it. And she realized that she really had, and she felt it. She thought, how did this happen? And it was really profound. And so she is now able to invite him at least back into the home and talk about it to find out that he has been in therapy and he's been doing the work. And she says, well, we're going to have to go slow here and build something. But the possibility of being friends and hearing one another exists. That's the power of forgiveness.
Strikes me as you're talking, Eileen, that this conversation is also really about anger, and obviously there's a function to anger, and anger can be healthy and bring about change. But quite often in therapy, you see people who are quite stuck with anger, don't you? And I think, thinking about how we embody our emotions, anger makes us kind of become smaller and tighter, harder, which is kind of the opposite of a state of well-being. When we think about being expansive, being full of love or compassion, that makes us broader, bigger. It's not, the two bodily postures associated with those emotions are quite different, aren't they?
They really are. And, anger, all our emotions are messengers. And anger serves a purpose. And anger is really telling us something has to change either within ourselves or outside of ourselves, and sometimes both. So obviously, if you're in harm's way, you better get out of Dodge. But then you better also take a look at yourself and hear what anger is saying. And it's basically saying something inside of you needs to be healed. And if you can't let go of it in an appropriate amount of time, there's a red flag going on as well. So it does serve a purpose. And as you begin to work through it, you do begin to experience something that's far more expansive. And that's why I actually love the Love Channel. And there's always something for us to love. We could be mad at our spouse, but every morning, who's cuddled up next to me besides my spouse is a dog that I just totally adore. And, I'm so happy to have the dog around that at the end of the day, I'm hugging the dog and talk about stress relief. And, there are times when you want to kill them, like the barking that you might be hearing right now. But, it gets you in touch with those feelings of love. And, we've heard it over and over again, the importance of love. And as a matter of fact, as you know, I'm doing a podcast, and my second series is on forgiveness as the highest form of love. Because when you think about it, you recognize that when you're able to forgive unconditionally, which takes work, what is the greatest gift you can give to someone? Is that unconditional acceptance, not expecting anything back or knowing you're not going to get anything back, but recognizing the humanness in that human being. And that part of that person is very worthy of your love. And that becomes powerful. And if we can give that in our own individual lives and in our communities, this world right there would be a better place.
Yeah, I think you're right, Eileen. I'm sort of struck as you're talking, really, about both myself and David have spent a long time working in the criminal justice system with people who've obviously committed really serious offences, the most serious that you can imagine. And I, just wonder about what are the implications of our knowledge and experience of forgiveness for our justice systems. Is it compatible with the needs of victims who've been seriously harmed?
When you were talking, I was actually, and I don't know if this answers your question, I was working with an organization called Fresh Start. And what that was about was working with women who were just released from prison. And I just loved those women because, as you know, the stories of what may have gotten them in prison are heartbreaking. And for many, it's about learning how to forgive themselves. And so this work becomes really powerful. And just to be in a group workshop and say to the women there, it's okay to forgive yourselves. Look at what you endured. Look at the psychological landscape from where you came from that got you into the situation that got you to where you ended up. That's a heartbreak. And so when people begin to understand that and begin to learn how to grow in empathy for themselves and compassion, that becomes really, really powerful. And so this is one of the things that I was teaching. And it's true for those that have to serve time. That I know people doing work in situations like that teach forgiveness, because everyone is worthy of being loved and everyone is worthy and deserving of being healed. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it triggered that in me to say.
Yeah, well, as you were talking, I'm reminded of, the Compassion Project run by, is it Fritzi Horsfeld? It's called the Compassion Project anyway, and she goes into prisons and asks people about their experiences and, to step forward if they've had had the experience of being physically chastised as a child, and if they were humiliated by how their parents spoke and so on. And I think as people, the films are always very moving, because as you hear about these experiences, people start recognizing that they are harmed, and it does seem to be that there's a need for us to forgive ourselves at times in order to be able to be a bit softer and more generous spirited, perhaps.
One of the hardest things for all of us to learn is self-forgiveness. It's actually easier to forgive others than to forgive ourselves. And, I really talk about that because we also hold so much guilt about what we've done. And I give people the space to talk about that. And then I also say to them, holding on to guilt is a choice too.
I think one of the things that would surprise people of the work that David and I have done, I think people would be surprised to know how much, self-hatred and that sense of guilt for the offences they've committed, how much of a striking feature that can be for people, where the self-hatred almost keeps them in a state of anger and rage, which doesn't reduce their risk. They need to be able to forgive themselves in order to be in a calmer place and be able to be less angry and less full of hate, really.
Well, and when you think about it, and this is actually reminding me of a story that I can share, but when you think about it, if you're filled with anger and hatred about yourself, sometimes that's too hard to even look at. And so all you do is see hatred for others. And that's where the need for revenge comes in, and on and on. It reminds me about a story that I wrote about. It took place in Lawrence, South Carolina, actually. And it was an unlikely friendship that developed between a black pastor, Reverend David Kennedy, and the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Michael Burden, which I find an interesting name. And what happened was that there was something called the Echo Theater, which turned into, it was a segregated theater during Jim Crow. And then Michael Burden, who owned it with another person named John Howard, turned it into what they were so proud to call the only museum for Nazis and white supremacists. I don't remember the exact name, but the whole idea was they were so proud of it. And here they were selling Nazi paraphernalia, and they were having these underground neo-Nazi meetings there at this theater. And Reverend Kennedy demonstrated against it, tried to get it closed for many, many years. His life was threatened by the Ku Klux Klan, but he kept the fight. He kept the fight. And then Michael Burden, he met his wife, and he began to question why he was in the Ku Klux Klan. He joined because he needed a home, and he needed a home and had all this hate, and he joined it because he felt that. He felt, this is my community, this is my group. But now that he was married and with a child, he began to question it. And then John Howard had a falling out, and Michael Burden lived in the basement of the shop, and he had to leave, and he had nowhere to go. And so he turned to Reverend Kennedy. And Reverend Kennedy was so touched by the fact that Burden cared enough about his family to reach out to him, that he gave him a helping hand and fed him and found a place for him to live. And they ultimately developed a relationship, and Michael Burden then sold his part of the shop, it was called the Redneck Shop, to Kennedy. And then Kennedy fought in court to get the deed of the theater. And eventually he got that, but there was a stipulation that he had to let John Howard, do whatever he wanted to do until he died. And he fought that too, and he ultimately won. And what happened was that Michael Burden really learned what forgiveness was all about. And they became very good friends, and they worked together for many, many years because of the forgiveness that Reverend Kennedy could extend to Michael Burden. And he learned a whole new way of living. And this is just one example of the power of forgiveness, and two very unlikely people coming together to work towards something. And eventually there was another man that got involved who was a historian for the theater, and he began to discover Hitler posters and business cards that the Ku Klux Klan would leave behind saying, if there's a next time, this will be a business meeting to scare Black families. And so now that redneck shop has become a museum of sorts where people come together for reconciliation and to talk about racial justice. And so that's what's happened to the redneck shop, which started out because someone was able to forgive someone else, and there was a profound healing.
Amazing story. I love those kind of examples of, really extreme individuals that you can't, it's really hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Of finding a way forward from that kind of position. So really lovely, beautiful story. Yeah, I mean, we've heard a bit about your kind of like dealings with other countries and what you learned there, but it does seem as though, some of the most progressive interventions in a more national way seem to happen in countries that would be looked down on a little, or seen as being not as progressive as some of the Western countries. Why? And yet, there's something much more progressive, radically so, in some of these other countries. There's a project, Aboriginal project, where perpetrators of domestic violence are integrated back into their local community. Some of these experiences in, Liberia, Rwanda, those kind of countries. What conditions enable some of these countries to do something that seems so hard for us to do?
I think it's, first of all, that in some of these cultures, it's certainly true in Rwanda, it's certainly true in South Africa, and another country where I know it's true is Sierra Leone, where forgiveness is already built into the culture. So I think that's one point. And the other point is that the US, we're such an individualistic society, where these other countries are much more communal, and they understand the importance of communities. It reminds me of another story, and this was like in Sierra Leone. They have a process called Fambul Talk, which means family talk in Creole. And it began to emerge after their civil war, where, there was blood on probably everybody's hands, which is so common in all of this kind of thing. And at first there was a special council that came in, like their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a special court that cost millions of dollars, that eventually only prosecuted 10 people after 2 years. But it wasn't touching to the grassroots, where the people, they were the ones that suffered. It was their houses that were burned down. It was their family that was raped or killed. And so a man named John, who was a civil rights activist in Sierra Leone, tapped into what was indigenous to the culture, which was storytelling. And through this whole process, developed Fambul Talk, which is based on storytelling around the bonfire. And there's a lot of preparation that goes on before that. But basically, once the community is prepared for all of it, and which could take a few months, because the community is so important, perpetrators will come forward. And so a victim of a crime will tell the story and say, if so-and-so is here, I want you to come out. I want you to come out. And that person comes out and shares their story and asks for forgiveness. Some get down on their knees. There's certain symbols where in societies it's begging for forgiveness. And usually the forgiveness is granted, and then people go dancing around the bonfire, and the next day have a cleansing ritual and a feast, and then community building kinds of things, where now the person who is a victim of a crime and the person who is the perpetrator of the crime have been able to come together and talk and reknit the community. And it's very, very powerful. And it can only happen in societies where communities are the family. And so they're just remarkable stories that are around that. And we actually have a little bit of this in the United States with the Amish community. Within the Amish community, they teach about forgiveness. And this is why I feel so passionate about building a culture of political forgiveness for all of us. And in the Amish community, this was tested, I think it was in 2006 or in the early 2000s, when a man named Carl Roberts went into the schoolhouse in the Amish community, and he lined up 13 elementary school girls, and he killed 6 of them. And the first thing that the Amish community did, and then he killed himself. And then the first thing that the Amish community did was to go to the widow of the man who killed their children to make sure she was okay and said it all was forgiven. And there was a story of a grandfather preparing his granddaughter, who was one of the girls that was killed, for burial. And he was saying to his grandchildren that were watching this, we need to learn to forgive the man who did this. Now, how many of us could have done that or said that? You must learn to forgive this horrific situation because everyone is worthy of forgiveness. Their default is forgiveness. And a friend of mine talks about we need to expand the menu in our country from anger and grievance to put on that menu forgiveness. And that's why I do the work that I do.
Certainly much needed at the moment. Eileen, you've told us some fascinating, very powerful stories here. But you've written a book called Finding Forgiveness. What's that about? What's the purpose of this book?
I wrote that book because I understood that if people knew how to forgive, maybe more people would engage in forgiveness. And so the book is basically a self-help book on how can we learn to forgive. And included in that book are stories. And they could be stories ranging from your next door neighbor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's included in the book. And each chapter kind of focuses on the steps. And I talk about the steps in the beginning of the book. These are the steps, and they've got kind of graphs to see where they are along the steps. And in the back of the book, there's also visualizations to help people. But it's to really help them understand that forgiveness is for everyone, and you can do it, and here's how. And here are some stories of people who've been able to overcome incredible situations and have been able to forgive, and what their experiences have been as a result of it. That's what that book was all about.
Thank you. We will, of course, put a link to that in the show notes, Eileen, as we will for your podcast. Can you tell us a bit about the podcast?
The podcast is called Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace. And here, the purpose of the podcast was to help us learn how to bridge our divides. How can we move forward and reduce our fear and be inspired by people who've been able to do that? And it has a focus not only on individual forgiveness, the first few episodes really are focusing on that, but how we can begin to heal our communities through the process of forgiveness. How can we begin to build bridges through learning how to forgive, and what does that look like in our communities? And it's also, again, to inspire people who hear these stories to learn how to be able to forgive. And And right now we've got people who've talked about individual forgiveness, forgiveness on a community level. A woman who's worked in Kenya, who's helped communities in Kenya learn how to forgive. As a matter of fact, I just interviewed someone yesterday who will be talking about Sierra Leone and Fumble Talk and all of that. And so for people to also understand, what do we mean by political forgiveness? And here again, we all have agency to participate in this kind of process in our own communities and in our own countries. So that's the purpose of that. And I think on a larger level, my ultimate hope for the podcast is that we can build a culture of political forgiveness around the world. And so I'm hoping people from all four corners of the globe to listen to this and recognize we can all do this. This is really to empower people to understand what this process looks like, that we can all engage in it, and that if we do, we're building better societies and better nations. And that's my hope, to really begin to build a culture of political forgiveness, or at least to plant the seeds for it.
Thank you, Eileen.
So Eileen, you've obviously seen quite a bit of the dark side of humanity in some of these stories that you've been exposed to. How have you maintained your own well-being and wholesomeness?
That's a great question, by the way, because for those of us that are working in difficult situations, be it in prisons or be it in war zones, we have to take care of ourselves first. And so as I tell my clients, self-care, self-care, that holds true no matter what and no matter where I am. So when I go to areas of conflict, if it's safe to go walking outside, I will. A lot of times it's not, but I definitely will be at a gym if it's there, or yoga in my room. But I think the real saving grace for me is my meditation practice and my practice of gratitude. So whenever I'm in an area of hardship or difficulty, every night I am sitting in prayer, in gratitude, and in meditation. And that's what gets me through. And then, of course, sharing this with people that I love. Thank goodness for WhatsApp or for the community I'm working with, to share and to feel that sense of community wherever I am, because it can feel very isolating and lonely. And so we have to try to keep connections with our community. But it's the prayer, the gratitude, and the meditation that's what gets me through.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you so much, Eileen.
It's just been a wonderful opportunity to talk to both of you about something that's just so near to my heart and something I'm so passionate about. So I'm just so thankful for the opportunity and want to thank you for inviting me on your podcast.
Thank you. It was really great to get the chance to speak with you in depth about this. I've enjoyed your book, which, as David said, we'll share a link to.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, we just love having these opportunities to learn from people from all over the world. Thanks very much.